Happy Monday, happy December, everyone. And for those who um, celebrate the Julian calendar, happy first day of Advent. Um, and welcome to the latest episode, I don't know what number, of PatristiCast. Today, I am very delighted to welcome a panel for what's going to be a very fascinating conversation. First, we have Professor Anna Marmodoro. Did I pronounce that correctly? Um, and you are a professor of you are I'm going to get this right this time. Leonard and Elizabeth Eslick Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri, and Honorary Professor of Philosophy at the University of Durham in the UK. Volker Drecoll is Professor of Church History at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And Johannes Zachhuber, a returning guest here, for I think your third time, is a professor of historical and systematic theology at the University of Oxford. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
So, we are going to talk about two figures that haven't gotten a lot of discussion on this particular channel. We've got Basil of Caesarea and his younger brother Gregory of Nyssa. Volker has just published his book, Basil of Caesarea as Exegete, which is an examination of Basil's homilies on the Hexaemeron, and the newly published Gregory of Nyssa on the Hexaemeron, text, translation, and essays, edited by Professors Zachhuber and Marmodoro. Okay, where to begin? Perhaps first, we can begin. I suspect most of the people who watch this will have some sense of who Basil and Gregory are, so we don't really need to get into some of those biographical details, although they might be helpful at some point in our discussion. But the Hexaemeron, um, the 6 days of creation. Volker, in your book, you situate Basil's homilies within the broader context of fourth century exegetical works on the Hexaemeron. So first, what is the importance of the Hexaemeron in the fourth century? Why is this becoming something these early Christian writers are grappling with? And who are some of these characters with which Basil is engaged, some of his interlocutors?
Yeah, so where to begin? Yes, to begin with, I would say so Genesis 1 as a text about the origin of the visible world is the main topic. So Genesis 1 is then read as a kind of, say, scientific report about how this world, this visible world, came into being. And this could be placed beside texts like the Timaeus of Plato. And this would be linked to a claim that some Christians said just, okay, we have a better text. Plato is a maybe important text for Platonists, but we have something that is better, namely
Mhm.
Genesis 1. So, and when I came to the topic, I was a little bit surprised that many comparisons were done in scholarship with Origen, with Platonists,
Mhm.
but not exactly with the authors directly in the mid fourth century. So, and when I came to that, especially Eusebius of Emesa, but also others such as Diodor or even the fragments that we have from other authors, I my impression was that these authors read Genesis 1 really as a kind of literary description of science, of the
Mhm.
scientific origin of the world. So it's about physics, etc.
Mhm.
And just the choice of the literary genre to give sermons and to say, okay, we make something about for the edification of the church changes the whole thing. So it's a kind of critique to those people who read Genesis 1 just like a scientific report.
Mhm.
And the interesting question is, how is this related, A, to Origenism and B, to Gregory's work? So because in Gregory we have a completely different world. I fully agree with Johannes that there's a kind of rediscovery, say, of allegory or allegorization, say, and this caused just some thinking about how strongly how strongly so how strong was the influence of Origenism really on the thought in the fourth century. And following up this track, my result was to say, okay, what do we really know about Origenism and how can we describe that, say, after Pamphilus at the beginning of the fourth century and before the first steps of the Origenist controversy in the 70s. And now my impression is that there's a kind of gap of reception of Origenism in the fourth century, and there's a kind of rediscovery of Origen in the 70s. And one of the first authors who is dealing with that is Didymus, and then others such as Evagrius, of course, Gregory of Nyssa, etc. They come with similar ideas, though they are all different. So Didymus, Evagrius, Gregory, for example, we could compare them, and we would find a lot of differences. But anyway, they are picking up again Origen, who was absent from the discourse in the mid-4th century. So yeah, this maybe is the first impression.
So you bring up a couple of things. There's this looming question of Basil's Origenism, and even defining Origenism is a challenge. It just seems to me, much like modern readers can't help but read Origen through the lens of Nicaea, even though Origen lived, a century before Nicaea, died 3/4 of a century before it. Many fourth century writers are often read in light of their reception of Origen. And Didymus is a key example. Many people just kind of accuse him of being an Origenist without any original contribution on his own, which is kind of silly when you read Didymus. And I think Basil has a similar reputation. But the other thing you bring up is the Timaeus. And Anna, perhaps you know the question to this better than I do. I remember Mara Niehoff wrote an essay quite a while ago now, I think, well, maybe not that long ago, on middle or maybe Neoplatonic debates on the Timaeus. I think in maybe like the 4th and 5th centuries, where she kind of gets into that. Is the Timaeus, Plato's version of cosmogony, is that being debated among the philosophical schools in the 4th century that might contribute to what Basil is up to?
Thank you for the question, John. I think that Timaeus, it's a really interesting moment in Plato's philosophical trajectory. So I take the view, like David Sedley, that is quite late it's a late dialogue in relation to most of Plato's production. And what I find most interesting about it is that it's the only dialogue, I would say, where Plato turns his attention to the creation of material objects and the ontology of material objects. So excuse me, it can be considered as the story of the creation of the world or the cosmogony of the world from a classical philosophical perspective. And certainly, Plato says lots of things there that are relevant to how the Christians later would think about creation. So what, from the limited specialty that I have in this area, what I would say is that what's very interesting is that Plato thinks of the creation of material objects in the Timaeus, positing that they come to be from something that already exists. So for Plato, there are copies of the forms that somehow are received by what he calls the receptacle or chora, and by being received by the receptacle, receive a location in space. And this is basically how material objects come to be. Now, as I say, the crucial point there is that all there is to creation is the operation of a demiurge that sets in order what is already there. And when we analyze the ontology of this material object, it's copies of the forms and the receptacle. Now, this is interesting, and I would say in contrast with what early Christian thinkers think about creation, because their problem is to think how God creates things ex nihilo, a perspective that the classical philosophers didn't have. And when in thinking that God creates things ex nihilo, on the one hand, they depart from the classical tradition and the Timaeus. On the other hand, they approach the problem with premises that are from classical philosophy, and that generates very interesting lines of thought. But I'll stop here and let others jump in, or if you want me to say more, just give me a sign.
Okay, very good.
May I?
Yes, please.
So in Porphyry, we have this wonderful discussion if the creation of the world, as described in the Timaeus, is really a process in time or something like that, or it's just a kind of description of how the ontological dependency hierarchies levels are established in an eternal way, so without any process of development of that. And Porphyry is clearly in favor of that. And if you say so, then it's very interesting that how Christians dealt with Genesis 1. So are these 6 days really 6 days? Or is this a kind of simultaneous act of establishing the entire world? So, and it's very interesting. I think that already in antiquity, we have this concept that the 6 days are not really 6 days of Genesis 1, but you have to interpret them differently. So if you follow the track of Anna and would say matter is a kind of ungenerated principle, say, but if you take that together with the Neoplatonic view that matter is non-existent, more or less, yeah. So then everything depends from the creator. So and that's how Porphyry read that just the creator as nous, as intellect, thought how the world, the entire cosmos should be designed, say. Yeah. So, but this is an eternal process without any development or whatever. But the question is matter really something that is already there in a certain sense, or is that still just nothing because you cannot really describe that?
Well, can I jump in there? I mean,
Yes,
just to
please.
I think you gave us two very interesting issues to think about. But before we come to the nature of matter, I want to just expand a little bit on what you said on the nature of time. This is very, to me, it's very striking that early Christians think that there is a time during which creation takes place, but also the fact that there is overall a moment in time where creation begins. And that, as we know, generates a lot of theological puzzlement. Why did God decide to create exactly at that time rather than any other time, and so on and so forth? So the ancients don't have this problem, in the sense that there is no moment in time where things come to be, except that for Plato in the Timaeus, there is the generation of time itself. Which again, is simply ordering of things that are already there. So modeling the processes in the physical world according to the movements of the eternal beings, namely the stars and the planets. So time is certainly, the fact that early Christians think there is a moment in time where creation happens, and the duration to creation is extremely interesting. I'll leave my colleagues to comment on that before maybe we return to matter.
Can I?
Yeah, Johannes, you have stuff to add?
I mean, I should probably wait for a prompt to be introduced, but I'm sort of a bit tickled to respond to this exchange or perhaps go back to something that Volker said at the outset, because it seems to me that there's something really interesting and significant going on in these sources that he's he's writing about in his book, and he's used this expression that they start reading these first chapters of Genesis like a scientific textbook, or you use the phrase a bit like that, right? In both in your book and also in how you presented it. And it seems to me that this is really quite significant. I mean, I don't doubt at all that it's true, but it seems to me it's significant for the following reason. I think it's one thing to say that, well, I'm a Christian, I read, let's say, the Timaeus, or I read some other Stoic, whatever books on natural philosophy, and then I obviously find things there that don't really work with my own Christian principles, such as creatio ex nihilo, as Anna said, or whatever. Um, and so I have a sort of selective reception, and I say, well, in a way, there are all these philosophers who talk about the origin of the world, and they get it wrong in some ways. Seems to me that's very, very different from seeing, I believe that in Genesis we have we have a sort of literal account of the origin of the world that is superior by definition to anything that the external philosophers could ever say, because it is revealed, it has God as the originator of the story. Moses is the privileged prophet who received his information straight from God. And I think, I mean, I just wanted to sort of point to this. I mean, it seems to me there is something really quite radical going on. And it is, I mean, I have to say that is very interesting in light of some of the science and religion issues that we've had in the past, let's say 200 years. Because inevitably you get things like flat Earth, right? Which you have, at least in some of these fourth and fifth century authors who take this science textbook approach, you end up with ideas that aren't all that different from what we have in some of the sort of fundamentalist modern forms of Christianity. That you don't have to argue why something is, why you don't have to argue in a sort of speculative way about what it means to create from nothing or something like that. You basically say, well, it is there, and in the way the description is offered, we just have to accept it on authority. And if it contradicts the generally held view among the Greek and Roman whatever scientists of the time, well, then that goes to show that all these Greek and Roman thinkers, who obviously were all pagans, didn't have the privilege of access to revelation. So I mean that's actually one of the really exciting things that came out for me out of Volker's book. And he's right. I mean, it's not as if the information wasn't there previously, but few people bothered to talk to it. And if I wanted to be a bit more provocative, I would say, well, the kind of text that Volker looks at aren't, I mean, for the majority, for the mainstream of patristic scholars, theological scholars of the fathers, are very attractive, because you want to have a different story. You want to have a story where hexaemeral exegesis moves from Origin to Gregory of Nyssa to Augustine, and says, well, there's really an alternative to this whole conflict of science and religion that we have in modernity. And it's all because they were happy to use allegorical interpretation, and that allowed them a much more open-ended theological reading of these texts. And that is something that perhaps we should learn from in our own time. Now, here I speak partly as a theologian, really, but partly, but as we all know, historical theology can never really quite be detached from theology the same way. I'm sure Anna would agree. Historical philosophy can't be detached from the contemporary agenda that people have. So, and anyway, so that's sort of what really is striking to me about this sort of learning about a project of scientific, whatever that meant in the fourth century, scientific reading of the early chapters of Genesis. And I mean that's one of the reasons I find this whole conversation today really exciting.
One thing that comes to mind is So we've talked about the Christian sensibility of creation out of nothing, which really, I think, safeguards for them God's primacy over all of creation. And in Plato, there's um, these multiple first principles that are existing co-eternally. So there's no creation from nothing. And I can imagine in the rise of early Christian intellectual life, uh, second century perhaps, um, certain pagans who were philosophically inclined would question the narrative in Genesis 1 on its reasonability. Origen, sadly, we don't have his commentary on Genesis anymore. We have his homilies on Genesis, but we don't have his massive commentary on Genesis except a few fragments. But elsewhere in his first homily on Psalm 77 or 78 in our modern NRSV versions of the Bible, Origen tackles the verse from Psalm 77:1, I will open my mouth in parables and utter problems from the beginning, connects it with Matthew 15:35, where Jesus quotes that passage. And then he links it to the philosophical schools, where he says, just as among the philosophers, there are problems that they go over with their students, so too with us. Scripture has certain problems. And the first one he brings up as an example, and this emerges as a significant point of discussion in both Basil and Gregory, is that the sun does not appear until the third day. So I can envision a world in the third and fourth centuries where Hellenistic philosophers, non-Christians, are saying, how can that be coherent in your understanding of creation, that God creates out of nothing, but the sun, which gives light to the earth, does not appear until the third day. That is completely irrational. Is that uh, let's talk a little bit more about this. So why do Basil and Gregory make a big deal out of this? And what do they do with it? How does explaining this particular philosophical problem, or perhaps textual problem in Genesis, help us understand better what's going on? Volker, maybe I can throw that to you first.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to my mind is first that we have exactly a good fragment of Origen's commentary on Genesis on exactly this question. It's a big fragment on Genesis 1:14 about the
Yeah, that's
creation
right.
of this.
In the Philokalia. That's right.
Yeah, in two places we have that. One is the Philocely. So I doubt that Basil has something to do with that. So
We're going to
let's,
talk about that because I'm
yeah,
going to take
maybe,
issue. I'm
yeah,
going to
yeah.
take issue with
Yeah,
your
I
argument.
know. Yeah. So this is a nice example how divided scholarship is
Yes,
something just
yes,
according to the borders of language. Yeah. So
yeah,
in
yeah.
France or Italy, it's a pretty common thing. So if I go there, they all agree, yeah, of course. And if I come to US, oh no, the philocally should be attributed to Basil. But anyway, so the second thing that might be more important here is that a secondary transmission of this fragment is given by Eusebius in his
Oh,
Preparatio
yeah, right.
Evangelica. And what interesting is that these two fragments differ because in the version of Eusebius, the last part where Origen provides his own solution, what's the role of the sun and the stars, especially, is presented. This last part of the fragment is absent from Eusebius.
Mm,
And Origen's solution was to say the stars and everything, the whole astronomical set there is significant. It rules the world, but it cannot understood by humans, but only by angels.
mhm,
And then exactly this point that it can be recognized by angels is dropped in by Eusebius, and it does not show up in Basil, though Basil is a lover of angels. So
mhm,
I'm pretty sure personally that he would have jumped on that if he would have known it.
mm.
But anyway, the idea is always to say, okay, sun, moon, and stars are only established in a secondary phase or stage of the process of creation beneath the firmament, and then you can distinguish the firmament and the heaven that is mentioned at the beginning of Genesis 1. And this is a very, very important presupposition for the so-called Antiochean cosmology, that you have these ideas that you have a kind of globe, say, of does not matter at the moment if it is only a half sphere or a complete globe. And then you have like a tent, a second firmament in that, and there is only the place where these stars and so on are fixed. So they are not really important. They are relativized. It's an anti-astronomical, anti-astrological intention here in the exegesis. And I think it's very important because in Platonism, for example, the stars, sun, etc., are exactly the places where the highest intensity of soulish embodiment could take place. So this is where. So in the Timaeus, there's a wonderful thing that the idea is every soul has a star. And if it goes down then and gets embodied, so this is a kind of distraction. So we should return that. So this is a kind of promise even that you can say, okay, one day we will return and our soul will live there in one of these wonderful stars there without any deterioration or weakness. Yeah. So, and this is really, put in question by Christian authors. Here. Yeah. Not sure is this directly the point of your question. Though, but of course, it's always also an important point to say day and light are not what we are seeing today in our 24 hours periods.
Right.
By day and night, but something different, a kind of primordial light, say.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can raise this question if this is invisible light. That can be distinguished from the invisible light that is the light of God, and so on.
Yeah, that's actually quite important. I think Origen in other places of his works. Well, first I should mention just on Genesis 1:14, the fragment that we have in the Philokalia concerns the refutation of astrological determinism. And that part of Origen's argument, I think it's actually quite similar to the argument Basil makes in his Hexaemeron, if I'm not mistaken. Basil follows it closely, but of course he does his own thing with it. But Basil seems particularly concerned in his homilies on the Hexaemeron. He does this several times, where he's worried about people who worship the sun. And I wonder if there's not something even on a pastoral level, not just a philosophical, but a pastoral level that Basil is concerned with there, with the implications of perhaps Plato's system of regarding the sun as a kind of deity worthy of worship. And he's arguing, no, it's a created thing. It's not a divinity in itself. Origen, and I think you bring this out in your book, and I do agree with it. I question your hypothesis on the Philokalia, but Basil does. Origen in several places talks about the waters that are above the heavens and the waters that are below, these primordial waters, as these spiritual powers that kind of come into being first. He does it in a number of places. And Basil seems to take issue with that kind of a reading of the waters and the firmament. So there, I think that's a clear indication that we can't just read Basil as someone who's dedicated wholeheartedly to Origenist, whatever that means, exegesis. But he does seem to be quite worried about the pagan implications and practices of sun worship. I don't recall that coming up in Gregory's homilies. Ambrose, in his homilies on the Hexaemeron, which are almost identical to Basil's, he might as well have rewritten them, more or less. in some places also had that concern. But I don't know if there's something there or not. What your thoughts are on that?
So, yeah, I was just joining a conference in Strasbourg where they are preparing a new edition of Ambrose
Mm.
Hexaemeron. And my duty was to compare Basil's and Ambrose approach. And it's very interesting that where Ambrose picks up the criticism of allegorization, he drops the harsh critique and transforms that into a kind of
Yeah.
let's just be humble and stick to the text. So he's really, and that opens the door for several passages in Ambrose where he really uses a pretty strong allegorical interpretation.
Yeah. He's more
So,
sympathetic to it, that is for sure.
yeah, so he did not follow Basil in his anti-allegorical effect. Yeah, so it was really different in that. So use of the text. So Ambrose thing is of course much longer. Yeah, so it's just the double or whatever of
Yeah.
text. So he expanded that. Even he shortened something, but the most often occurring thing is that he just expanded that considerably by own thoughts. And many of them are indebted to Philo or Origen or others. Yeah, so it's he's combining Basil against what was Basil's main intention, I think. Yeah,
Mm.
it's very interesting how this was transformed then by Ambrose. Yeah. So yeah, I would say it's not really worship of sun. I would say it in a more general way, astrological thinking.
Mm.
People are really using horoscopes and other things for figuring out what they should do. So it's not really, I would say, a really hard philosophical point that is attacked here in Homily 6, but it's more a kind of general common behavior. You could call it pagan, but many Christians use horoscope as well, just reading it for fun or for whatever reason. So, I would say he's attacking that. And of course, as worship of sun, you could think even of Manicheans, but I
Yeah.
doubt that they are very present here in
Mm.
the text of Basil. So he had only a superficial knowledge of that. So I would really say this is more about this general behavior of late antique societies
Okay.
that they use horoscopes and similar things.
Okay. Johannes, did you want to jump in? Look, it looked like you kind of wanted to
Well,
jump in.
I mean, it's opening another can of worms, and perhaps I should say a bit more about Gregory, given I'm here as the editor of this book. I mean, but I can't quite resist the temptation of saying, one thing that when we look at the history of topics such as the exegesis of the Hexaemeron, I think even more than with other um, topics, we have a tendency, I think, to abstract this largely from the surrounding political and social history. I mean, it seems to me, even though it's probably hard to prove it, it seems very hard for me not to believe that this movement that Volker is talking about has something to do with a different, let's say, power balance between Christianity and paganism that we have in the late fourth century compared to the third century, right? I mean, of course, I mean, if someone like Origen polemicizes against certain aspects of pagan worship, well, there are kind of two aspects there, I would say. On the one hand, he and other Christian authors are keen to use inner philosophical debates that already exist and basically just make use of Stoic or Platonic arguments that are kind of taking a bit of a cheap shot, where he says, like, you all know this is wrong, and yet you basically tolerate it, or they're using it really to consolidate a sort of inner Christian a debate where you say, well, you are obviously not allowed to worship the sun or something like that. But it seems to me that by the time we come to the late fourth century, there is obviously an entirely new front, and the new front is what's the ideology, so to speak, of the Christianized empire. And there is people who were in a position of power must have been of influence, like bishops, like Eusebius of Emesa or others, must have seen that there's now the possibility of pushing for a Christian perspective
Mm,
that can actually become the predominant viewpoint
mm,
in an empire which in its entirety is moving towards the notion of a Christianized world. So I think again, I don't know, Volker, whether you have views directly on that, and maybe hard to
yes.
prove, but it seems to me if people just say, okay, we have Philo, we have Origen, we have Gregory of Nyssa, yeah, that looks great if we're just looking at the history of ideas.
Yeah,
But the
absolutely.
moment we ask, what is the role of Christianity in the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries, then I think these factors must play a role as well.
Yeah, so in my epilogue, I jumped exactly on that point, saying how different is the world when it comes to Gregory of Nyssa in comparison with Basil. If you come from Basil, seeing all this dealing, how you should not use this text exclusively as a kind of scientific report, but you should add some edification things, etc., moral applications, whatever, and then come to Gregory and see what Gregory does with these texts. So this word is completely different. How he is even related to Origenism, how he uses that, how he uses Platonic materials. So, but if you go back from Gregory of Nyssa to Eusebius at the beginning of the fourth century, you can see the large cultural difference. Eusebius was proud to present Plotinus as a forerunner of Christian thinking. He could say that. So, we are lucky. He did, more or less they discovered the most essential things about our Christian doctrine about God, even on Trinity, whatever. And even if he was criticizing Platonism harshly in the book 13 of Preparatio Evangelica, he would agree to, okay, the main points of our Christian thought, we can prove them even by using pagan sources, say. So, and Gregory of Nyssa does not do that anymore. So, and he used a lot of Plotinus, whatever Platonic thinking. Plato himself, yeah, so it's clear that Plato is always there. But I had the formulation at the end: the use of Plato is a kind of disguised use. So it's a veiled one. It's not really an open use. He even says, if it comes to Plato, forget all this image of the chariot and all the details of that, and let's not jump into the exegesis and interpretation of that. So if you check all the references where Plato is mentioned in Gregory of Nyssa, these are awful statements, yeah, about this big thinker, but he uses it all the time. Yeah? So and the question is, what caused this hidden way of use of Platonizing language? And I think you are exactly right. This is a transformation of the cultural climate, intellectual climate in the Roman Empire in the fourth century, at least in some circles. So I would say it's not a general thing, but I would say it starts in some Christian circles where they have the idea, oh, here we are, now we go with our Christian things, and hoi exortem those outside, they are really bad guys. So we will not use them in the future. So I think this is really a significant change. And maybe it's already more and more intensively there at the end of the fourth century than we normally think. I think maybe it's so I at least was trained in a tradition where we would say, oh, paganism was still alive in the end of the fourth century and was still a dominant force in the fifth century and so on. But maybe a cultural change was quicker in the late fourth century than I was used to imagine. At least say, yeah. So, and my suspicion is especially monasticism, yeah. So this is my suspicion. I cannot prove that really, but if I look for what are the circles, the milieus where these harsh reluctance toward pagan sources takes place. So Basil wrote a book, How to Read the Pagan Books, more or less, yeah. So, but Gregory did not, yeah. He used Plato and condemned him in the same moment, yeah. So, and this is very interesting how this quick shift between the 60s and the 80s takes place. And I think Gregory is a pretty good case for that. Yeah. So, but it's still a hypothesis, and I would be interested, Johannes. I made a risky assumption at the end, saying, okay, maybe the new reception of Origen is linked to that. that you could no longer use Platonist sources directly, but you could use the origin because he was a Christian thinker based on scripture. So he was a source of wonderful ideas that you could directly link to your exegesis, but you could introduce something and present that as a Christian thinking, and it's no longer based on, I don't know, some Platonic sources. Yeah. So if this makes sense, I'm thinking of that. But yeah, so this is one track I'm pursuing. Yeah.
Well, the second part brings up the issue again of Origenism, because Basil preached his homilies on the Hexaemeron, what, early 370s, is it? I can't remember the date exactly. He died in what, 379,
Yeah,
381,
this is,
something like that?
yeah, but 1st of January, so let's say 78 or 77. Yeah, so it can
Okay,
be
okay.
debated. Yeah.
So the the uh, the seedlings of the Origenist controversy are just starting to sprout at about this time with Epiphanius. And then it really comes to full bloom at the end of the 4th century. So there's also this issue that Basil and Gregory are both dealing with, aren't they? I mean, it would seem that if they had a sense that they were free to cite Origen explicitly, they would have done so. But did they? I don't know. Does Basil ever say, Origen says this, or does Gregory ever say that?
Yeah, Basil does. So
Oh, he
Basil,
does.
yeah, at the end of his on the Holy Spirit, he gives a kind
Oh, okay.
of catalog of Orthodox witnesses, and he mentions even Origen. And I was for a long time used to use this passage as a use or as a proof for the Origenist character of Basil thought. But it's
Mm-hmm.
a very skeptical remark to say, okay, he might not be really a good sound thinker. So
Mm-hmm.
you should be careful if it comes to
Yeah.
origin.
Yeah.
But still, even he agrees what I'm here presenting as a right and correct and orthodox
Mm-hmm.
pneumatology. So, but it's a kind, he origin is picked with, so it's with fingers, yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
very, very carefully, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I would say you cannot really doubt that Gregory of Nyssa, for example, in his exegesis of the canticle, is a really heavily dependent upon origin. Even if he transforms that in some sense, you could not say
Right.
Gregory's origin is like Didymus, yeah. The
Mm-hmm.
use is different, but I would still say so. This is, and Gregory's use of origin comes before the harsh criticism of Origenism in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exactly the gap. So Basil came to this problem of the early first steps of this Origenist controversy. And Gregory was in between. So before this whole thing was heating up in the 90s. So
Mm-hmm.
and that's was very formative then for him to use origin, I think. And maybe he should not have done that, would not have done that if he would have lived 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Just as it is. So it was really this concrete situation.
Yeah.
You know,
No, they didn't have social media back then, or at
no.
least they didn't have Twitter back then. But it is quite striking how attuned they were to things that were going on in different regions of the Mediterranean, because the what boiled over in the late 390s with respect to Origenism happened in the Egyptian desert. What was it? The monastic communities of Nitria, I think, is where that really flowered, and Theophilus, the bishop there. Um, but the Cappadocians were very well aware of it. I can only assume, and they're navigating their way through it as well. Um, I as much as the shifting landscape of Christianity in the Roman Empire, we can even be more take a narrower approach and say that it's kind of the shifting landscape of origin within the same time. And I think it fits. One of the things Basil, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm off here, but one of the things Basil seems worried about with allegory, in the case of the Hexaemeron, is that it can the critics can use that as an indication that Christians are simply anti-intellectual. They're not able to grapple with these issues at a scientific level that, someone like Porphyry, for example, could. And Basil's response then is to really get into the science, well, natural philosophy at the time, the physics, and I think Nyssa too. Anna, your essay, maybe this could be a good segue because you guys, both you and Johannes have essays in this one. It's not just a translation; it's a translation with the Greek text and essays. And here, you talk. Okay, so I'm gonna quote you here. Let's see. Substratum or no substratum. Here you're getting into Aristotle and so on and so forth. Gregory appears to consider Aristotle's well-known argument in Metaphysics 7.3, which I call here stripping away argument, a potential threat to the assumption underpinning his position on the divine creation of matter. This is why he reproduces the argument and tries to argue against it. Okay. First, in like a Aristotle for dummies fashion, what is the stripping away argument, and what does Gregory do with it in his on the Hexaemeron?
Thank you, John. You're bringing us back to something very interesting that Volker had introduced in the beginning. So I'm very happy to enter the conversation.
I like to bring things full circle.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say, well, thank you for that. I want to say, yes, it's an important aspect of the work that Johannes and I have done together, and we want to communicate to the listeners today that we are looking at these early Christian thinkers and particularly texts that have been so far perhaps underappreciated, trying to bring out not only the text itself and the best translation we can of it, but also we try to illuminate some issues in the text that are looked at by different specialists. So I come into this picture as a philosopher looking at Gregory of Nyssa, who for me is an incredibly interesting thinker, perhaps the patristic thinker I've taught the most of. Because of his interaction with classical philosophy and his capacity to innovate in relation to classical philosophy. So against this backdrop, I just want to say, we spoke already about the relationship between Gregory and, for example, Plato, Platonism, Neoplatonism, and so on and so forth. But I think it's less evident to the reader, perhaps without classical philosophy training, that Gregory is also very influenced by Aristotle. And by this, I don't mean, he read the metaphysics, but that there were ideas from Aristotle's metaphysical thinking that probably were circulating one form or the other, orally presumably, or in some version. And one of these is very important for Gregory and early Christian thinkers. That's a question of whether material bodies are material because they are composites of matter and form. So it is interesting to the early Christians because, of course, now we have God that is the creator of everything. And so did God create matter too when he creates things, so out of nothing? And in previous work on Gregory of Nyssa, I've already touched upon the question. I think the early Christians worry about this because of the fact that they embrace a principle from classical philosophy that the like causes the like. So something hot can cause something to be hot. A human being can cause a human being to come to be. But how can God, that is an immaterial being, a good, perfect entity, and so on and so forth, bring about matter, which is material, but also the source of much, let's say, evil in the world. So the Christians grapple with this question, and Gregory does it in a very interesting way. So I think in this particular essay that you refer to of mine, I look at Gregory and concomitantly also at Basil, trying to argue against an argument of Aristotle that they read as threatening of their position that God did not create matter. They want to say there is no matter, there is something else instead. I can expand on that later, but there is no matter that God has created. So to prove that, they engage with this argument of Aristotle, the so-called stripping away argument, which is generally understood in the tradition as an argument following which Aristotle posits prime matter, a propertyless substratum that serves as a bearer of all properties. So you asked me to just give you a quick version of the argument. It's very interesting. So I'm hoping that our listeners will engage with it mentally in their own time. So just think of a material substance, whatever you want. It can be a book, it can be your desk, computer, a person, and just try this experiment of abstracting away all properties of these things. So you can start from the more like superficial ones, let's say color. You go a bit deeper, you strip away by abstraction special dimensions. And, once you have stripped away, if you can do this as a thought experiment, all properties, what is it that is left? And Aristotle, in that chapter of the Metaphysics you quote, says, well, what is left is oule, the Greek term for matter. Now, so the question debated, by all scholars is whether it is oule, matter, that is left is a thing, and if it is a thing without properties, how can we understand it? How can we characterize it? How can we posit it in our ontology? So I think the early Christians tried to engage with these arguments, particularly Gregory and Basil, to show that actually at the end of that thought experiment, whatever Aristotle finds is not matter, is not this reified substratum that serves as a bearer of all properties. So I insist here on the word reify. So the problem is not so much there is something at the end of the thought experiment, but that whatever it is at the end of the thought experiment is not a thing. It's not a thing in the ontology. It's not an entity. And I think the early Christians, particularly Gregory, really understands well the argument and tries to say, look, in the spirit of Aristotle, it's not that the thing remains, it's just something remains, and then we have to understand what something is. So just wrapping up, what I'm saying is that I found interesting engaging in this Hexaemeron of Gregory of Nyssa, the discovery of how deeply engaged he is with classical sources and Aristotle, that is not often mentioned as a person that Gregory would engage with, and how intelligent the reading of Aristotle's argument is done by Gregory. And third point, how that particular argument was of interest to Gregory, but was also of interest to Basil, who came to slightly different conclusions, and then later to Chalcidius. So it's clearly something central to the thinking of thinkers of this era. And that's why I found very interesting to engage with that. Thank you for bringing me in on this topic.
So
Anna, I have a question to that exactly.
Please, yes.
So I wondered a little bit why you referred to Aristotle in first place, because I have read this passage always as a kind of counterattack against the Stoic concept of apoios hyle. So of course the Stoic idea goes back to Aristotle. So, but the question is, who is the main opponent here?
Yeah.
And my impression was a little bit, maybe both, but maybe this Stoic concept. So Johannes and I have a longer discussion about what substance and ousia is in Basil. So, and we are more or less agreeing on the fact that it's not the Stoic concept of apoios hyle or hypokemenon as such. So that's maybe interfering here a little bit. But could you a little bit say about that?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. The reason why I think that both Gregory and Basil and later Chalcidius really are thinking of Aristotle in whatever version they knew about Aristotle is because of the argument that they give. So they literally reproduce in their own terms the stripping away thought experiment of Aristotle. And that's why even if the Stoics came to entertain in their system something that might be read as echoing like, Aristotle's matter in Metaphysics 7.3. The Stoics have no argument that matches the one of Aristotle. So it's by comparing arguments that they came to the conclusion that that Gregory and Basil are thinking of Aristotle. It's not the end point, it's not the Berles substratum that is the important is, but how they come to argue against it. And it is, in my view, by reproducing Aristotle's argument. That's why in the chapter that kindly John quoted and that I contributed to the volume, I reproduced the Aristotelian argument and then next to it the Basil version and then the Gregory version, then the Chalcidius, which I think for me is further evidence that there is really a line of tradition of this particular argument of Aristotle. Incidentally, I want to say, Wolfer and everyone, it's really interesting how this argument keeps puzzling scholars of Aristotle. This is one of the most, not so much in the 2000s, but I think it's one of the most written on arguments of Aristotle. So this is like not direct evidence, but it would make sense to me that it puzzled the ancients as much as it keeps puzzling us.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, it's also my experience if you teach that. So if you're just explaining, so imagine this table without any properties. So what is left then? And then students are just thinking of, how can we imagine this? So even if we have to drop any quality of wood or whatever, so it really becomes a kind of knot in your brain then.
Yeah, but so it's not a thing. It's not a thing in the ontology, not a reified entity in the ontology, but still does some work, I think, for Aristotle and differently for Basil, different from Gregory. And this is, I want to emphasize here, I'm a great fan of Gregory. I think that is philosophically a sharp mind, at least for what I've seen of his work. So worth disseminating this to our readers as well as listeners.
Of course, and I mean, just to pick up on this, and it raises a really interesting point, which is, could one argue that the debates between philosophers and Christian theologians about creation from nothing, at least if we look at someone who's philosophically sophisticated the way Gregory is, are partly, seem much about sort of having a much harsher opposition than it really is. And it's really more a question of what you actually call the thing that you're talking about. And I often, when I teach creation from nothing, I often think, if you're a Platonist or an Aristotelian, might you not, or even a Stoic, might you not say to the Christians, are you really sure we're not talking about the same thing? And if you think of what the way Basil and Gregory used this stripping away argument, I mean, what does it actually mean for them to say that when everything's gone, when you've stripped everything away, there's nothing left? I mean, isn't this nothing just a sort of meh on that? I mean, how can you actually make the case that a sort of total nothingness is left there, or isn't by using this Aristotelian argument, couldn't one say that at the end of the day, even though they would say it's not matter, they're kind of saying something that's actually not all that different from Aristotle?
I would say, at least for Basil, it's clear that's not the path he would follow. He says, if you would do that, you would be insane, more or less. You cannot do that. So it's just
I mean, Basil, of course, always has this additional layer where he's kind of saying, oh, I offer you this speculation. But of course, this is all empty speculation and it's a waste of our time anyway, where you always wonder what the rhetorical purpose of that is, and whether he's playing to two different audiences, the kind of sophisticated minds who want an intellectual argument, and then the kind of simpler minds who say, well, isn't the whole point of being religious that we don't have to worry too much about these complicated questions? Or perhaps that's not something a true Basil student would want to accept.
I would accept that he says something like, I know all your arguments. I know all your debates. It's not just dumbness that I'm not jumping on that. Yeah, or ignorance or whatever. So I think the philosophical and scientific passages in the homilies has this point, have this point, yeah, to show, okay, I'm familiar with all these discussions. I'm familiar with Aristotle, Historia Animae, whatever, yeah. So don't come with me and come to me and say, okay, yeah, you are just ignorant. You are not reaching the level of discussion that is necessary or appropriate. So, but I would still say for this point exactly, if it comes to properties of essence or substance, I would say the point of Basil is not that you can say there's a meon that has then no properties, but you have really to say, okay, everything that exists has already some essential properties. Even if you can recognize some of them, you cannot figure out what the substance as such is. And this hidden black box in each substance or each thing is very important to Basil, I think. And yeah, the argument is then not in favor of establishing a kind of nihil that can be positively described or something like that. I would distinguish these two things a little bit.
Can I just jump in? I promise that this is the last thing I say on the topic, but I think that it's very important to distinguish the idea that the argument leads to there is nothing from there is no thing,
Absolutely.
no thing. And in my understanding of
Absolutely,
Gregory,
yeah.
So in my understanding of Gregory, what he thinks God creates are physical properties that are intelligible, and so there is no violation of the like causes like principle, because God is intelligible, he creates intelligible properties, and they make up, I say here in scare quotes, matter. And so it's not that there is nothing once from which things are like made out. It's rather that all the things are made out of are properties. That's how I understand the position by Gregory, and also particularly the way he thinks about that is the thought experiment of Aristotle. But let me just say, we have no time to go deeply into this, but if you compare the versions of so if you compare how Gregory, Basil, and Chalcidius deal with Aristotle's argument, what's really interesting is that there is more to an object, to a material object, than just the properties that make it up. And I think this, whatever it is, there is something that kind of holds them together and serves as the, I want to say metaphysical glue. And so
Nucleus of
well, no, I don't want to say that because that brings us back to the idea that there is a thing,
okay.
namely the nucleus. But I want to say that particularly Chalcidius is very interesting. Like he decomposes the thing into properties and then tries to put them together. And when there is anything more than like the properties, when I put them, decompose a thing and then compose it back into what it is. And I think so. They're all very intelligent thinkers, are dealing with an important argument of Aristotle. I'll stop here. Time, I think, is tight on us.
Well, okay, so that brings me to Johannes and your essay. This thing that holds these properties together, is that logos for Nyssa? Your essay, logos in Nyssa's on the Hexaemeron, is that what holds these together?
Well, I mean, I definitely think that Gregory's treatment of logos is one of the most intriguing aspects of the treatise, right? I mean, there are several things going on as far as I can tell. On the one hand, he's conscious that there is this older sort of logos Christology, which was in the second and third century used to read a Christology into the doctrine of creation and into the interpretation of Genesis. And he clearly doesn't want that anymore because he's conscious that if Christ is homoousios with God or with the Father, then he can't be a sort of mediator of creation. But what's he left with? It seems to me he's left with really two realities, and I think logos can be both at the same time, even though it isn't entirely clear to me how they can be both at the same time. The Logos, on the one hand, is really a totally sort of divine reality, something like God's will, God's creative energy, and as such completely um, connected with the divine ousia, the divine substance. But then Logos is also something like the internal organic principle of creation. There is something like an immanent Logos. He never tells us, as far as I can tell, how these two are related. Because clearly you think that if Logos is a sort of immanent to God, if Logos is God's word and God's will, then it can't also be immanent in the creation and vice versa. And yet he seems happy to sort of oscillate between the two, and he's definitely saying that the way Genesis 1 um, uses the references to the word to drive the story forward is a way that the author, i.e. Moses, tells us, gives us a clue that the world's governed by, I mean, we would today say natural laws, right? That the world's governed by dynamic principles interior to it, which also ensure that it develops from this sort of initial beginning into the kind of huge world that we have today. Um, so does the Logos hold the world together? Yeah, presumably it does that too. I mean, it seems to me that most of what he wants to say is that Logos is responsible for akoulouthia, for the order and structure of the cosmos that we have. Would you also say Logos, there is a Logos sort of in each individual thing, and that this holds the individual together from its properties? I mean, that's an idea you have obviously in someone like Maximus a few centuries later. Um, I mean, I'd be tempted to say that if we ask Gregory, that if John could have, we could bring Gregory back into this podcast, and if John would ask him this question, he might say, "Great idea. Yes, that's kind of what I also think." I'm not at this moment really aware of any passage in the Hexaemeron, and not really anywhere else where he's actually making that point. But you're absolutely right in light of what Anna said. It seems like a very logical next step, because he clearly doesn't want the coherence of things to be based on a sort of underlying material or non-material substratum. So yeah, sorry, that's not a very definitive answer, but anybody I think who's read Gregory will know that it's sometimes not entirely easy to know what the definitive answer to the kind of question is that we want to ask of him.
Johannes, sorry, I have this question. If you compare that with Plotinus' intellect and how the soul works, is this really different? So we have all these problems of the universal intellect, say the divine thing that was really thinking the world. And then at the end of all these activities, there are individual souls, not really just part of that, but more or less identically working in a sense, implementing then via soul the thinking into objects. So is this
But I
the
don't, I mean,
comparative structure? Would you follow?
I mean, I don't want to sound sort of too dogmatic on this point, but it seems to me that in a way Plotinus doesn't have a doctrine of creation, and Gregory does. There is a reason why Plotinus ultimately needs a concept of matter and Gregory doesn't. And there is a way in which Gregory believes there is, in many places. I mean, one thing he does say very often is things like, all being can be divided into the created and the uncreated. And I don't think Plotinus could have said. I mean, I don't even think that would make any sense to Plotinus, um, because because the being is ultimately one, and it is one that kind of unfolds, as we know, for in this pyramid from the one via the intellect and the souls, and then somehow it percolates down into the material world. And and I just don't really think that this is how Gregory thinks. And actually, to sort of flag up one, in my view, really very important essay in this book is Gretchen Schilz's piece on the Stoicism in Gregory. And I have to say, Gretchen's really persuaded me that that's another sort of blind spot of a lot of the scholarship, and that a lot of what we find in Gregory in terms of his cosmology makes more sense against a Stoic backdrop than specifically against the Platonic one. Now, I'm not saying that Gregory's view of Logos is easily compatible with the view of the traditional Stoicism, but I don't think it's so easily compatible with the vision of Plotinus either.
My comparison was only the universal and the individual impact. So of course, I'm not claiming that he is just following ontology of Plotinus. It's clearly not the case. But to have this idea that how the relation between such a universal logos that is really a divine heavy figure, and then the kind of immanence that is not only present to the world but to each individual object, as far as that is a living being or a kind of formed, shaped being, something like that. So there's a kind of structure in that. And just in Plotinus, we are looking for a solution, how he imagined that universal function, the individual one, intellect, soul, and so on, how this works really together. And I think it's very comparable to this fuzzy thing of logos in Gregory, in some sense. So just wondering if this would make sense, yeah.
I mean, there was a time when I believed that, and when I went over all the texts for the purposes of this particular chapter, I decided there's. I mean, I think there is more of a. Well, I don't know. It's a dangerous word. There's more of more of a dualistic element than I think someone like Plotinus will be comfortable with. But I don't know. Perhaps I'm drawing the line there a bit too categorically at the moment. I mean, there's definitely. I mean, this idea that the nous is one in many. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to say that is a good, a helpful paradigm also for understanding how Gregory thinks about the relationship of universal in particular. Absolutely. I think if it's just that, I'm happy to agree with it. I just think that the way Gregory speaks about logos in this treatise seems to fall into these two classes, and as far as I can tell, he never really explains. He never does, what Maximus, who clearly must be a reader of Gregory, well, Maximus then does that for us, right? I mean, Maximus says, "Oh yeah, and in the process of creating, the one logos becomes many logoi, and the many logoi become one." And you have all this language in Maximus. As a reader of Gregory, you think, "Oh yeah, that's perhaps, probably, hopefully, possibly what Gregory thought." But you also may think, well, Maximus may have been as frustrated, perhaps, or frustrated, if frustrated is the right word, in dealing with a church father, but as kind of puzzled by reading Gregory as perhaps I am, and he kind of substitutes a solution that will be very elegant, but which I don't really think is in Gregory's text.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of other things that I wanted to cover, but we're getting to about 90 minutes now. So perhaps we can wrap up. There's a lot to discuss here, and perhaps part of the problem is, as Gregory says at the very outset, uh, where he's writing to his brother. Why are you doing this, O man of God, goading me to dare what must not be dared, and to attempt deeds not only impossible to achieve, but even, in my mind at least, not innocent to attempt? Gregory opens his on the Hexaemeron with this what might seem like a throwaway or some rhetorical device, uh, really suggesting that this is a problem of epistemology, right? Do we have the mental capacity, the intellectual capacity to grasp these things precisely? That reminded me of Origen's opening to On Prayer, by the way, where he does something very similar. Um, but perhaps that's why there's so much more to discuss about this issue in Basil and Nyssa, because quite frankly, we just can't grasp everything. Our intellects are somehow deficient. But I think this discussion has been a wonderful introduction, and I hope it spurs on for the viewers future research on these very important questions regarding these two very important thinkers on these very, very important subjects. So Johannes, Volker, and Anna, thank you guys very much for a wonderful and fruitful discussion.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, until next time, I will see everybody, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.